Michael Lynch, welcome to Build to Sell Radio.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to be with you. TinyPilot. I want you to describe this product to a layperson. And if you want to visualize a layperson, like, look at me. I don't know anything about technology, so I want you to explain what TinyPilot does to a layperson.
Sure. So it was a little device that you plug into a computer, and it lets you control the computer remotely without installing any software. So it just lets you see what's on the computer in a browser window, and you can type keyboard input or move the mouse and see what's on the screen.
Okay, so what's a use case for this? Like, why would I want to do that?
So the reason I created it initially is I've got home servers at my house. And so they're just set up in the corner of my office. They don't have any monitor or keyboard attached. They're just headless servers. And so if I wanted to do something like install a new operating system on them, or I did something stupid and I screwed up the network and I couldn't log in remotely through software anymore, I would need to drag it over to my desk and connect it to like my main desktop monitor and keyboard. And it's a big pain because like then I don't have access to my desktop anymore. And so I wanted some way of having something I could just plug in and not have to drag hardware around my office. And so TinyPilot let me do that.
Give me some other examples of how your customers use the product. So this is a physical device, like it's a piece of hardware.
Yeah.
That you plug into your computer.
Right.
And then when you're in another location, you can access your computer as if you were almost there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it differs from, there's a lot of remote access software like Microsoft Remote Desktop and TeamViewer and stuff. But the limitation there is they're software based. So they can't, if the person reboots the computer, like you lose access, or you lose, if the computer doesn't have network connectivity, you lose access. And so another use case, we had like IT departments that would want to be able to install an operating system on their client's machine, or be able to change like early boot settings. And so they would just say, okay, here, I'm going to hand you this TinyPilot device. You plug it into your computer. And then once you do that, I'll have access. I can restart the computer. I can change whatever settings, upgrade the operating system.
Oh, that's like
cool.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? We use a remote IT guy at Value Builder. And so whenever I have a problem, he'll use like Go to Assist, the Citrix product, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And he'll like access my computer. But
yeah.
The problem is there's limitations. Like if he's got to reboot, like we use connectivity. And that's a big part of solving for any sort of major, it's often like do a full on upgrade.
Right.
Isn't that interesting? So having the piece of hardware that an IT guy or gal can just give to their client and say, plug this sucker in. And I'll be essentially next to you.
Right.
That's cool. Okay. So it's called TinyPilot.
Yep.
I mean, I've got so many questions about like, how do you get like a piece of hardware? How did you get the money to like spec it out and get someone to manufacture it? Like that sounds really expensive to me.
Yeah, I got very lucky in that the earliest versions just used off-the-shelf components. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Raspberry Pi, but it's a inexpensive credit card sized computer. It costs about $35, and it's a full computer. It can boot a Linux operating system. And so the first version of TinyPilot was just using one of those that you can just buy from the store. And I found like a cheap video capture card that they started manufacturing in China, like right before I became interested in this. So it was like a $10 dongle. And then from there, like the Raspberry Pi already has built-in functionality where it can pretend to be a keyboard. It can present itself to another computer as if it's a keyboard. And so between just having a keyboard and being able to capture video from another computer, like that's all you need for remote access. And so that was all I needed. Like I didn't need to do custom manufacturing. The first version was just a kit of off-the-shelf parts that I resold. Like I was just buying things from other vendors and saying like, hey, if you want to support this project, you can buy this kit from me. And it was at a markup of like twice the price, but it was still only like a $60 or $100 markup. And so people that thought the idea was cool wanted to buy it.
So you're buying stuff from Raspberry Pi. It's funny, second time I've heard about this company this morning, which is bizarre. But in any event, so you're buying this piece of hardware. You're buying a dongle,
Yep.
which is a little connectivity, like a device to connect to a computer. And like literally that's it.
It was that. It was like an AC adapter. It was some USB cables, but yeah, it was a pretty small amount of stuff. It was also a case because the Raspberry Pi ships without a case, so I found a case that would enable people to build it the way I had.
But the final product, like, and I've seen a picture of it. It looks like a real, like, it doesn't look like it's a duct tape thing in your basement. Like, it looks like a real piece of hardware.
Yeah. There were a lot of iterations between the first version and what I ended up with.
But you didn't have a ton of money to invest in this early version. You just bought stuff off the shelf. That makes sense.
Right.
And how did you get customers for this thing?
So I wrote about the process of developing the prototype. So before I had a full product, I wrote about just getting the keyboard part of it working. Like before I could even capture video, I wrote about like, hey, if you have a Raspberry Pi, you can basically use it as like a virtual keyboard. And other people had done it, but I made it a little bit easier than other people had done in the past. And so as I started doing that, I said, hey, I'm thinking about making this a full product. So if you're interested, like, let me know. And a few people had reached out and said that they would be interested in pre-ordering it if I actually got a working product together. And so then I wrote a follow-up blog post about a month later when I got the full thing working. I got video capture and keyboard emulation working. So at that point, it was like a very minimal but complete solution. And the blog post became really popular. And I think people enjoyed just the story of how I got the first thing working, because originally it was like I got the video capture working, but with an 8-second delay. And then I found some other tool or I found some other hardware and it got it down to like a 4-second delay. And then finally it got it down to like a 200 millisecond delay. So it felt like pretty real time. And so the story of it became popular on, there were a few subreddits that liked it. And then it became really popular on Hacker News, which is Y Combinator's social media platform. And I sold out, like I had optimistically bought a kit, like enough inventory to sell 13 kits. And those sold out within like 2 hours of the blog post. And I was like, oh, wow, I got to buy more of these.
And I've heard of this term building in public. It sounds like to some extent that was what you were doing. You were sharing all the guts and glory of starting a company in public so that garnered you notoriety. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know how much it helped the initial launch. Like, I think the initial blog post wasn't so much about the business of it as much as just like the technical challenge of it. But afterwards, I did. Yeah, what I was doing does match what people describe as building in public. I write monthly retrospectives about how my business is going, and I share a lot of the numbers.
And how did that impact your overall journey, just kind of documenting it in public like that?
I don't think it directly leads people to buy, because it attracts a lot of people that are interested in entrepreneurship, which is not exactly the same people who want a remote access hardware device. But the thing that I found really valuable is it forced me to really think through my strategy. And I would often sit down to write a retrospective and think like, there's no point in me writing this. There's not much to explain. Like everything I did this month is simple, or like everything I'm planning next month is really straightforward. And then once I think about it, I realize that there's some opportunity I'm missing, or the thing that I thought was simple is actually very complicated. And there's different ways to solve the problem other than what I thought when I sat down. And so I found that so valuable, just forcing myself to sit down every month and think through like a few big ideas of what did I want to do last month? What am I trying to do next month?
I'm a huge believer in the power of writing it down. Bezos is famous for, forcing his employees to kind of write a pre-read for every meeting. And
right.
I find even doing something as simple as a pre-read before a meeting, it helps you organize your thoughts in a way that like, at least for me, I feel like it's so clear in my head. And then I start writing and I'm like, oh no, it's actually not clear. There's all these
definitely
chunks that are totally like leaps of logic that can't be proven. That's interesting. That's really interesting. So you were writing about this journey that you were on, both from a technical perspective, but then later from a business perspective.
Yeah.
And so I'd be curious, what changed in your perspective? Because you're a relatively young guy. For those watching on YouTube, you can see Michael's not heading off to retirement anytime soon. What made you want to build this thing to sell? Why sell it, I guess, is my question.
Why sell the company, or why sell the product initially?
No. Why sell the company?
A few reasons. So I'm a software developer. My background is in software development, and that's what I really love. And I had initially gone into this thinking that the software would be the valuable part. Like it was originally just off the shelf parts, and I thought, right now, like people are buying the kit from me, but like eventually the real business is going to be in me selling software that people can install on their own hardware, and they'll pay me some yearly fee for maintaining the software, and that's going to be the interesting part of this business. And I very quickly realized that that was not the part that people value. People really value having an all-in-one solution where they just get something, they plug it into their computer and they're done, rather than they have to buy 5 different components from 5 different vendors.
So it was the hardware that was the actual piece that customers valued.
Yeah, like I did sell the software licenses for a paid version of the software that you could buy even if you didn't buy the hardware from me, but it was such a small percentage of our revenue, maybe like, I don't know, probably less than 3% of our revenue. Most of it was from people that were interested in the hardware. And so, yeah, the first reason was just I missed writing software, and the company grew to me and 6 teammates, 6 employees and contractors that they all worked part-time. And so most of my job became management, just making sure that those teams were unblocked, and like as the company evolved, that they could continue moving forward and doing interesting work and advancing their careers. And then the other big reason is that my wife and I were planning to start a family, and the business itself, it didn't take a ton of time. Like I generally spent like somewhere between like 30 and 45 hours per week on it. But I carried a lot of stress with it, because with hardware, there's so many moving pieces. We had like for a large part of the business, we had like our own office, and we did all the fulfillment and manufacturing ourselves. Or manufacturing, I mean like the assembling the parts together.
Assembling, yeah.
But anything that went wrong in the office, like if the internet went down in the office, that's a huge emergency, because we're stuck until that's fixed. Or there was one time there was a flood in the office and we didn't have access for a week, and so we were stuck for a week. And just I'm generally like a worrier, and so I think about all the things that can go wrong. And so yeah, there's just so many things that so many risks that require immediate attention in a hardware business like this, where you're covering both the manufacturing and the sales and the software development. And I felt like, once we have kids, like I want to be able to have the business be a contained part of my life. I don't want it to be like, there's a manufacturing defect, and like either like I drop everything to focus on that, or we're going to lose like $50,000 in profit over the next month. And so I wanted something. I thought it was time to hand the business over to somebody else who had like more bandwidth that or was like better at just managing risk and not stressing about it the way that I do.
I have so much respect for people who run product companies. I've always had sort of service and software, and the first iteration of Built to Sell was actually self-published. And for the first time, I had to figure out like how many units we needed to buy, and like what warehouse to put them in, and how we would like handle logistics and currency, and like paper quality, and that paper's out of stock, so we got to go to oh my gosh, it took me about 5 minutes to go, I'm never doing this again. I never want to touch a physical product company again. It's hard.
Yeah,
really freaking hard. It's really hard. I have such respect for you, having done it for so long, and you got this business to being like a decent sized company. Like, how much revenue were you generating by the time you decided to sell?
By the end, it was $1 million a year. So
awesome.
I ran it for 4 years, and at the end of 2023, we had $1 million in revenue.
Got it. $1 million in revenue. 7 employees, including yourself, and the employees were a mix of sort of contractors and full time.
Everybody was part-time, but it was a mix of like employees and contractors. But I mean, the distinction didn't really matter. It was just because we had an office, the two people that worked in the office, like for legal reasons, have to be classified as employees. But like I kind of treated everybody as the same.
Yeah, got it. And so how much profit were you making on the million?
I believe it was like 225 that year, 225,000 in profit in the fourth year.
Got it. Okay. So after you're paying for the hardware, you're paying for the employees, you're netting $250,000 a year.
Yeah.
And if I'm reading between the lines here, because that's a good lifestyle business, you could keep that going forever, but you're like, there's just so much stress. I've got a kid on the way. I just want to de-stress a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Makes sense. And so what did you do? Like, did you market it for sale? Like, walk me through the process.
Yeah, I didn't even know what to do because like, it's such a weird business. Like I have a lot of friends that have SaaS businesses. And so I understood what they could do. Like I knew paths to sell that, but I was like, I don't even know what kind of business this is considered. Like, am I an e-commerce business? Am I like a manufacturing business? Like I didn't even know who to talk to. And so I started reaching out to different people, and I also wasn't even sure if like I should tell people that I'm considering selling, because like maybe that's going to spook our customers, maybe it's going to spook our employees. And so I just started having conversations with other founders, and like especially if I knew other founders that worked on hardware, I would mention to them that I was interested in selling and just kind of see if they even knew anybody. And the first brokerage I reached out to was FE International, because I'd heard that they were good for like bootstrapped small businesses. But I knew them only as like a SaaS brokerage. I didn't know them to do anything with manufacturing or e-commerce. And so the first one that I really reached out to was FE International.
And what did they say?
They responded that they were pretty interested at first. They heard the revenue numbers and saw the growth and thought it was a potential match. And then they asked a few more questions and asked to see details about like how the sales were split across the different products I was selling. And then the broker that I was talking to eventually was like, after maybe 3 or 4 emails, said, yeah, I don't think this is ready to sell. Most of your revenue, like at the time, it was like 97% of the revenue was just, I only had one product. I had 2 variants of one product. And he's like, yeah, customers aren't going to like, or buyers rather, aren't going to like that all of your money is coming from just these 2 variants. So you should work to get it to the point where you have maybe 10 different SKUs and no single SKU is representing more than 30% of your sales. And at that point, I was like really panicked, because I was like, how do I do that? Like, this was, I think, in 2022. And I was like, that was a really tough year. And I was like, I'm barely scraping by just like managing just one product and like manufacturing this custom hardware. And you're telling me I need to do 10 times that much. Like, I was like, I don't know if there's ever going to be a buyer, if that's true. And so, yeah, like that was pretty scary to hear.
I would imagine it. And so unusual. We hear the opposite so often, that, you know, being a world leader in one product makes you irresistible to a strategic acquirer.
Yeah.
And diversifying across multiple products can often mean a bunch of sort of Me Too products that aren't well differentiated. So that's an interesting perspective. So what happened? I mean, that must have felt like crap to be told your baby's ugly.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't even so much like I was offended that they didn't like the business as much as like, wait, but like, how do I get out of this? Like, I've never had a job before where I couldn't just leave if I wanted to leave. And so I was like, I mean, either my options are like, I run it until I die, or I just like shut it down and like tell all the employees and tell all of our customers like tough luck. And I didn't really like either of those. And so I figured like, okay, if there's no path to selling now, like maybe I can just figure out what's making the business stressful for me and work on those things. And so that was a big part of what I focused on in 2023, is just like, okay, like I find it stressful having this office that is so critical to our business, and it's like a single point of failure. So let's see if I can get rid of the office. Let's see if I can outsource that to other vendors, like a contract manufacturer and a third-party logistics warehouse. And then that lets us get rid of the warehouse. And I looked at the things that were making the business stressful, and I thought like, okay, like what can I do to make them less stressful, or can I get rid of those parts? Even if I have to sacrifice some profitability, I'd rather have a business that I can run sustainably than something that's going to just feel like a burden forever.
And what was that process like? Were you successful in getting rid of the office and making it less?
Yeah, it was really difficult because, with manufacturing, it's so delicate. And we also were at the point where we were basically like at our limits of assembling devices. So we were able to assemble maybe like 150 devices per month, but we were selling 150 devices per month. So we didn't have a lot of buffer. And at the beginning, I didn't even know what a 3PL was. Like, I didn't even know that you could just
third-party logistics company for those who
I didn't know you could just, like, there are companies where they have a warehouse and you can send your product to them and you connect Shopify or whatever your sales platform is to their system. And then when orders come in, they fulfill it for you. And I think in the early days, maybe we would have been too small for most 3PL vendors. But so we talked to a few different 3PL vendors, and that's really hard too, because it's basically a marriage. Like, if you send them all your inventory and it turns out they're a bad vendor, then it's really hard to switch. Like, you'd have to, some of them have long contracts, but at the very least, you have to get them to ship all your stuff, like a non-trivial amount of inventory to someplace else. And so we tried it with one that it really didn't work out. It was like we had one of our like accessories as like a pilot program with them, and we found out that like there was a 24-hour delay between their system and Shopify, which is like really hard to work with. Because if we had a customer that said, we would occasionally get customers that are like, hey, I placed an order, but I put in my address wrong, or like I changed my mind.
Sure.
And so if there's a 24-hour delay between like us syncing with their system, like we don't know if it's shipped out already. So that didn't work out. We found another 3PL that ended up working better, but it was really tough because we'd been doing all the stuff in-house. And so figuring out how to transfer all those responsibilities to a separate company that there's like a lot of there's a lot of efficiency, because originally it was two team members that worked at our office. They were the same people that did customer service. They were the same people that assembled the devices. They were the same people that shipped them out to customers. So it's like very tight feedback loops between all these things. And so unbundling those was a real challenge. So it took us about 4 months before we got it to kind of steady state with an external 3PL. And then the other part was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just, 2022, you have this kind of false start with the broker tells you got to have more SKUs.
Yep.
And then in 23, you're like, okay, well, I guess I feel trapped here. I'm going to make the best of it and smooth out this business. Tell me about the next iteration of this sale, because some people listening might be like, okay, well, you smoothed it out. You made it less stressful. Like, again, you're making $250,000. Why sell? Like, sounds like a license to print money forever.
Yeah. I mean, I think with the profit that last year, like it was profitable, but there's also risk. Like I think there is risk that, that we saw the chip shortage in 2021 and something like that could happen again, or chip shortage was something that nobody even anticipated. So with a business as complex as TinyPilot with a hardware business, there are existential risks that I couldn't necessarily predict. And so even though we were making $200,000 that year, like I didn't know if that could continue, or if something was going to come up that was going to demand a lot of my time when I'm trying to raise a family. So that was a big thing. I was just trying to like mainly minimize the risk. But yeah, the next stage was actually, I read The Art of Selling Your Business, your book. I had read Built to Sell several years before. And that was also a big influence on the way I ran TinyPilot. And actually the whole 2023 strategy of like making it much easier to run was largely influenced by what you wrote about in Built to Sell, where I thought about like the things that would make it less stressful for me are also the things that might make it more attractive to a potential buyer. And so the next thing I did was like one of the things you emphasize in The Art of Selling Your Business is to try to find a strategic buyer. And so I looked at companies that were somehow complementary to TinyPilot. Like there are a lot of businesses that sold hardware to similar consumers, the people that like have their own home servers, or just people that were making similar products. And so I reached out to some of them, and most of them either didn't respond or said they weren't interested. But there was one other company that sold a product that was kind of similar, and we had a similar customer base, and they were really interested. And so I started conversations with them.
How'd that go?
It took a long time. So they every few months, well, they had a bunch of questions. We did a video call initially, and they seemed very culturally aligned with me. Like they were also bootstrapped, and so they were also located in the US, like had done custom manufacturing themselves, and like it felt like we really got each other, and so they were really interested in this. They had never been part of an acquisition before, and neither had I. So it was both of us kind of like, well, like we'll see how this works out. And so they had a lot of questions for me, and I would respond really quickly because like I wanted to move the deal along. But every time I would respond, there would be like a few week delay between when they would follow up again. And so finally, after about 4 months, they said, okay, we're ready to present you with an offer. And I was like, okay, great. And I had talked to different people at this point, and I was expecting an offer to be like the offers that I'd heard for a business like mine, or the valuations rather, were like 2.5 to 3.5x seller discretionary earnings.
And seller discretionary earnings, for folks who don't know, is kind of an expression of profit, which takes into consideration your, as the owner's, compensation. So you're pulling out of it as well as the excess profit. So okay, got it.
Yeah.
And so you've been told sort of on the street that 2.5 to 3.5 times SDE, seller's discretionary earnings, was a fair offer. So this would have been ballpark 750.
Yeah. And I thought even more for them because there's the synergy of our two businesses working together. And it seemed like they recognized that as well. And so finally they kind of wanted a lot of ceremony to the like presenting me with an offer. They wanted to do it live on a call. And so they tell me the offer, and it was $150,000 cash for the business. And then $100,000 for me for a full-time employment contract for a year. And then I think it was like 20% of profit for the first year, and then 10% second year. And I was pretty disappointed in that because 150,000 is like, it was less than 1x earnings, and $100,000 for a full-time contract, like that's less than like entry-level college grads are making for software jobs. And like at this point I'd had like 20 years of experience in the industry. So I was like, I don't want to sign a 12-month contract for $100,000. And I don't think they meant it to be disrespectful or anything like that. I think it was a combination of like, it wasn't something they were thinking about. They were just kind of like, you popped up on our radar. This is what we have to spend on this. This is like, given the risks and like the fact that this is like some of your stuff is new to us. This is what would make it worth our while. But we were like very far apart on valuation. So I just told them like, hey, like I really appreciate you talking to me, but I think we're too far apart to even continue negotiating this.
And what was their reaction to that?
They were polite. They were like, yeah, we get it. Like, you know, our door is open if you decide to revisit this. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I would rather, if at least it was an option of like not shutting down the business. If I decided like, oh, wow, like I really just can't find anybody on the open market to buy it for a better price, like at least I could come back to them and they would keep the product alive and keep investing in the team. So it felt like good news, at least in that respect. But it was also a little bit worrying of like, am I not going to find a deal to be able to exit this company for anything close to what I imagined?
Yeah, that sense of foreboding around being trapped is something I think a lot of our listeners really empathize with. There's that sense of, there's so many things I need to do to make it more valuable. I want out now, but oh God, it's going to take me years to figure out all this stuff. And is anybody going to want to buy it? And I think there's a lot of people that feel that sense of just trapped. I think you articulated the word perfectly. It's a real sense of just feeling trapped, and there's no easy out.
Yeah.
And so you had the false start with the brokerage, and now you've got a second kind of, I don't know, I want to say strike. I mean, at least it was validating there was some value there, but it was well below what you'd sort of heard. Where does it go from there?
So in early 2023, I went to MicroConf, which is a conference for bootstrap founders. And I was interested in going just because I'd never been before and I'd heard good things. But I also thought maybe I'll meet somebody there who is a potential acquirer, and maybe I can meet a brokerage. And so when I was there, one of the sponsors was this company, Quiet Light Brokerage. And I'd never heard of them before, but there were a bunch of brokers there because they gave a talk and they were one of the sponsors of MicroConf. And I met a broker named Chris Guthrie, and I really liked him. Like he seemed to be somebody that I could trust working with. And that was a big fear I had in working with a broker, because one of the scariest parts is just, it's like an experience I've never gone through before. So I don't know what's normal. I don't know, like there's a lot of, with the acquisition process, there's like a lot of people who don't have incentives aligned with you. And so like might be not trying to like trick you, but like not working with your best interests. And so like, it was really important to me to find somebody that I found trustworthy and felt like they got the business and weren't just going to try to make the easiest sale or sell it to somebody. Like I definitely didn't want to sell it to like a private equity investor who was just going to squeeze all the money out of the business and like not really invest in the product or the team. And so talking to Chris from Quiet Light, like it seemed like he got what I was going for, and he seemed pretty excited about it. And he was like, yeah, like I think we would be, I don't think we would have trouble finding a buyer for you.
So you hired him to take it to market?
Yeah. So we worked together for a few months, just kind of like talking about strategy and like what things I wanted to get done before we launched with Quiet Light. And so we ended up launching, I believe, in October of 2023. And so
what was on the list of things you wanted to get done, or Chris wanted you to do before taking the business to market?
It was mainly me. I think he was flexible in selling it in whatever state, but we were at the time, I mentioned like 2023, I was trying to like do all these things to make the business less stressful. And so at that point, we had already pretty successfully migrated fulfillment to the 3PL warehouse. But the other big project was moving assembly to a contract manufacturer. And that was like a pretty complex process because that was something we'd always done. And the manufacturer was in Vietnam. And so just not having that tight feedback loop, like it used to be that I could go to the office and like as soon as somebody assembled the device, I could look at it and say, yep, that looks good. And like even if we had made changes to the way we were building them, like there was a very fast feedback loop. But with the manufacturer in Vietnam, it's much more complicated. The feedback loops are at least like a week or two to see every iteration, and just making sure that they can not only assemble it correctly and to the quality standards we have, but there's also a software component to it. So they have to provision the software on the device. And so we want to make sure like the software that they're installing is like an exact match for the software that we produce, that like if there's like malware on their systems or something, it's not going to infect our devices. So just making sure that we maintain integrity throughout the supply chain. That was pretty hard to figure out how to make all that work. And so I was like, I don't want to try to sell in the middle of this. And I want to get to a point where like we've kind of safely landed the transition to this contract manufacturer. And that happened around October. And so that was why I wanted to launch around that time.
Got it. And so you get Chris to take the business to market. Like, does he put a price on? Like, describe sort of his process at that point.
Yeah. So Quiet Light has a questionnaire, and I think a lot of it is standard questions. They also put together like a packet that shows profit and loss statements for aggregated at the year level and every month for the past, I think it was 2 or 3 years. And So the questionnaire is a lot of things about the business and like what risks you see, what advantages you see. And it's a pretty detailed thing. And then they also do a video interview just so potential buyers can kind of get a sense of what you as the owner are like and what kind of business you've built. And so all that stuff, it was a few weeks of work to finalize that. And then Quiet Light was like very flexible. Like they gave advice to me about like what they thought a good valuation would be, but they really left it up to me of like what price I was comfortable with. And so I chose $599K because that was at the time 2.9 times SDE, and it just felt like kind of a nice like round number. Like it's like 600K and slightly under.
Yep. So it was 600 grand, which was 2.9 times SDE. So they take it to market. Out of interest, before I ask you what happened next, you were at 225 in profit the year you sold. How did you anticipate the impact of the new 3PL and the Vietnamese contract manufacturer to impact your profitability in 2024 and 2025? Was this just largely like a lifestyle arbitrage thing, or did you expect that it would improve profitability having these two contractors in place?
I thought it was going to be like roughly net neutral.
Okay.
I think the main thing, actually, I guess I take that back. I think the real, it wasn't that it would cut costs, but it did allow us to scale a lot better because going into 2023, we were limited by just like physically how many devices that we could manufacture. We were also at the beginning of 2023, or maybe we had already done this in late 2022. All the cases were 3D printed. So we were working with a 3D printing vendor who had worked with us from almost the beginning. And at the time they had these two printers that could use the material we wanted. And we kept on like getting to their limit. And so by the end, they had 7 printers just for us that were going 24/7. And it's like nobody really 3D, like we kind of 3D printed like long past the point where it made sense just because I didn't have experience. I didn't know how to get to the next thing.
But 3D printing is usually for like prototypes and like one-offs, to, like stamping out hundreds of these things a day. Got it. Okay. So you take the business. So you put a price of 600 grand on it and you take it to market. What happens?
Yeah. So for the first couple of months, it was slow. Like we had inquiries from buyers who wanted me to stay on or from buyers who wanted me to personally finance, or not personally, but wanted to finance the purchase out of profits from the business. And I'd heard a lot of horror stories about that, including in your book. And like probably the biggest nightmare scenario I envisioned was one of the case studies you included where somebody had sold their business and the new buyer like didn't really know what they were doing and tanked the business. And so they couldn't pay the financing. And so they had to give the business back. And then the new owner now ends up in this position 6 months later where they have their business back and it's in a terrible position and they don't really have the money. And I really didn't want that. And I had talked to other founders who had basically told me like, treat the amount that you get at closing as all you're going to get and everything else is a bonus. So like if you're financing it, like ask for a really high down payment, like 60% or more. Mm-hmm. And if you get more money out of it, then like, that's great. But like you should be comfortable assuming that you're not going to get anything else out of it. And so that was my restriction. Like I didn't want to work with buyers who wanted to finance the deal unless I really had to. So for the first 2 months, it was pretty quiet. And the buyers that reached out were not a match.
And what changed?
I think just luck. Like we heard from actually one big thing that changed was by the end of 2023, we pre-qualified for an SBA loan. So in the US, the Small Business Administration will provide or they'll guarantee loans from banks for buying a small business. And there's this like kind of odd process you can go through with loan brokers where you show them your finances and say like, do you think the SBA would back this loan? And the loan broker can say yes. And then you can tell buyers like, this business is pre-qualified for an SBA loan. I mean, it's unofficial. It's just kind of like based on the loan broker's guess. But based on they do it on an annual basis. And so based on our 2022 numbers, our profit wasn't high enough. And so based on 2023, when we had 225K in profit, the loan broker was like, yeah, this would probably qualify for an SBA loan. And so at that point, we were able to say like this business pre-qualifies for an SBA loan. And that opened up the buyer pool a lot. Quiet Light, they estimate that being SBA pre-qualified opens it up to like 10 times as many potential buyers.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was a big help. And so once we did that, we started getting more inquiries from buyers who wanted to go through an SBA loan.
And just, I'm not familiar with this process, so forgive my ignorance, but does the SBA or does the loan broker in this case give you an amount that they're willing to finance of the 600,000? Like what proportion of that they would be willing to loan money against?
I don't think so. They certainly don't give it to me as the business owner. I don't know. From the buyer's end, I think it's pretty similar to a small business loan. So the buyer goes to the buyer can pick their bank. The loan broker has some recommended banks that they can recommend to the buyer, but the buyer picks the bank. They go through the whole loan process with the bank, and then at the end of that process, the bank submits all the paperwork to the SBA, and the SBA takes a few weeks and says, "Yes, we'll back it," or "No, we won't."
Yeah. Okay. And we've got listeners all over the world. And if they're outside of the United States, I just encourage you to check into government-backed loans in order to facilitate or lubricate the process of buying and selling businesses. There are other programs in other jurisdictions, and they can be very helpful in getting a deal done. The SBA is the one in the US, but there are other versions in different countries.
Yeah.
So you get pre-qualified for an SBA loan. That opens up the buyer pool enormously. What's next?
So it was kind of lucky. At the same time, two buyers popped up within about a week or two of each other that both seemed like pretty strong candidates. The first was an individual buyer. He had kind of a similar background to me. He had worked in a corporate job, and he was just sort of tired of it and was interested in buying a business as a way to pursue entrepreneurship. And so his name was Scott. And then I was talking like not even through the brokerage. And Scott had found us through the brokerage, but then one of the customers just reached out to me and said like, "Hey, I'm thinking about building a managed services business on top of TinyPilot. Like, I want to talk to you about it because I want to buy like hundreds of devices from you." And I was like, "Great, but maybe you'd be interested in just buying the business itself because like I'm interested in selling." And he was like, "Oh, great." And like he had a co-founder and they were both pretty interested in the business. And so we went back and forth for a while. And so the first to make an offer was Scott. And so he came with an offer for 500K, which was about 100K below asking. And at the time I thought, we still haven't announced on Quiet Light that we're SBA pre-qualified. We could relaunch and find a lot more buyers. So it didn't seem that appealing to me to sacrifice the 100K. Plus, I felt like this other pair of buyers was pretty likely going to buy. But then the other pair of buyers, like the day after I declined the 500K, the other pair said, "Yeah, we're not going to make a bid."
Oh,
and
no.
They didn't explain. They just said, "Yeah, we decided not to." And I was like, "Oh no, did I just blow this?"
You're working this like competitive auction process, and then one party drops off.
Right.
Like, oh my god. So what did you do?
So we told Scott that we were planning to relaunch on Quiet Light at 625K, but I would still honor the 599K if he wanted to move forward before we relaunched. And then he said, "Sure, yeah." Then I think that was the next day. He said, "Okay, I'll come up to the 599K asking." And so we signed the LOI.
So you were going to relaunch. It sounds like almost like selling a house. Like you list and then you relist at a different price.
Yeah.
In this case, you were going to move it up in price because of this pre-qualification from the SBA.
Yeah, and our profit had increased since then as well. So I think we would still be at like 2.9 SDE, but our profit had shifted upward in the past 2 months. So we could value ourselves a little higher.
That's awful. So that's awesome. So originally he was at 500 grand. Then he goes to the 599 original asking price.
Yep.
And so deal done at that point. What happens next?
No, that was I thought that was like going to be the hard part, and then there was a lot of due diligence. So that was the part I think I was least prepared for in just like how difficult due diligence is. And I think of myself as very organized. Like our books were in order. We were like extremely thorough in documenting all of our internal processes, and like I'm like, as I mentioned, I'm very risk averse. So like I wasn't cutting corners. Like I thought everything looked good, but yeah, due diligence is just so thorough. And like,
what kind of stuff came up that was the most surprising? Like, what would other entrepreneurs be blown away to hear you got asked for?
Like invoices from 2 years ago. Like I had, like part of when you're calculating SDE, you can say you can subtract out things that are like one-time costs. They call them add backs. And so at one point I had spent a lot of money, too much money, on a website redesign. We spent $46K on a website redesign. And so I said, okay, like that's not a recurring cost. Like that's a one-time cost. So I'm going to take that out of SDE. And the bank was like, okay, I want to see invoices for like all of the costs that were related to the 46K. Like I had to go back and find all the invoices that this web designer had given me and like make sure they added up to the 46K that I was claiming was an add back. So, I mean, just there was a ton of stuff that the bank wanted to see. And then also like one thing I'd never heard of before was a disclosure schedule. Is that something you're familiar with?
I've never heard it referred to as that, but describe more on what you mean by a disclosure schedule, and then maybe we'll go from there.
So this was not something that I don't believe the bank requested this. I think this was part of what the buyer's lawyer put together an asset purchase agreement. And one of the things they asked for was a disclosure schedule. So it included like, the way we did it was an asset sale. So they weren't buying TinyPilot, the corporation, they were buying all of our assets. And so they were buying all the things that were in our office. They were buying all of our intellectual property, all our trademarks. But we had to list out all of our contracts. But in the disclosure schedule, it was, and this was part of what was so challenging about the process is like, I've never gone through this before. I don't know what's unusual or not, or like if this is just what everybody does. But part of it was like, we had to categorize every single contract we had into these like very like highly legalese categories where it's like all contracts related to indebtedness, except insofar as indebted, like stuff I barely understood. And each contract could fit into multiple categories. So it was like, yeah, I was just like so confused. And then to even like list, like, how do I even list like I've got this contract with our manufacturer. Like, what do you mean by list the contract? Like just say contract with manufacturer. But there's like, I worked with our M&A lawyer who said that there's like a special way that you have to describe the contract. At one point I had to describe every item in the TinyPilot office, like down to like a stapler. And I was like, I didn't understand. Like, I'm like talking to my lawyer. I'm like, are you giving me this requirement? Is the buyer giving, like, where is this requirement coming from? And I never really understood like who wanted to know that. But yeah, I had to like list out, like, we have 2 printers, we have 1 stapler.
It sounds though, if I'm understanding correctly, that this was largely driven not by Scott, but more by the SBA lender who wanted to make sure there was proper diligence applied to their loan. Is that in retrospect?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, like that's the thing. Like that's the thing that was very surprising about the SBA loan. And like, I think if I were to do this in the future, I would offer a lot more incentives to a cash buyer, because with an SBA buyer, and I think just with a buyer who's using finance at all, it's there's just so many more players involved in the process. And so when you get a request, like if you're dealing with an individual, like you kind of know where you stand in terms of negotiation. So if they say like, hey, I want to see like, if like a buyer who'd approached me and said like, hey, I want to see like every invoice you've ever received going back 3 years, I would be like, hey, like, I don't think that's necessary. Like, I don't want to do that. But like a bank, they have much less flexible policies. Like the bank, for the buyer, like they are motivated to close this deal. They like really want to buy the business, but the bank, like they probably do, 50 of these deals a month. Like they don't really care if one of them falls through. And so they're like, we have our process. Like we want to see all these documents. And if it's a headache for you, like we don't really care. So just like, that was something I didn't quite anticipate, is like, just with a buyer who's using financing, there's so many more requests, and it's so much more opaque about like the flexibility of like how much you can argue, how much you can push back on some of these requests.
Yeah, sounds painful. And did the deal close? Like what happened in the end?
Yeah, so it took 3 months. The first few months were mainly like just the first 2 months was mainly getting everything ready, getting all the documents that the bank had requested. So all the contracts, and they wanted to see like my driver's license and tax returns. And that was another thing that was really surprising. Like they asked for tax returns, so I gave the business tax returns. Then they were like, actually, no, we want to see your personal tax returns. I'm like, okay, like I didn't really want to do that, but fine. And then the other part was just negotiating the asset purchase agreement. So going back between Scott's lawyer and my lawyer, and just hammering out some of like most of it was standard, but there were a few things that were kind of subtleties to the deal. Or I know one of the things that I wanted that was unusual was I wanted a lot of leeway in terms of confidentiality. Like I wanted to be able to have conversations like this one. And I had been writing publicly about the business on my blog the entire time. And so I really wanted to be able to share like what the end looked like. There were a lot of people that like I know read my blog, and I would find it really strange if I had signed a strict NDA, it would just be like, I would kind of have to pretend that I never ran TinyPilot or something. Like I would just suddenly have to stop talking about the business and offer no explanation. And so I wanted it to be like a fairly liberal confidentiality clause where like I'm allowed to talk about things about the business that are not going to cause any problems for Scott. And Scott seemed on board with that as well. Like I think he also saw the value in like how I'd historically been running the business and sharing so much, and how a lot of that does, like, it only leads to positive things for the business. But I think translating that to the lawyers who are very used to more like locked down terms in terms of confidentiality, that was difficult. And so there were a few things like that where we had to go back and forth a bunch, just making sure our lawyers and the two of us were on the same page.
And was there any attempt to retrade on the $5.99 agreed price by the end? Did you?
No, I was afraid of that just because we're like with an e-commerce business, like we don't. It's not like a SaaS where you have subscription customers like paying the same amount every month, and so like I think in month 1 of the sale, our revenue dropped like 20%, and I was like, oh wow. Gosh, like. Which is not actually so unusual. Like it's within the noise of our business. Like our numbers would jump up like 10 or 20K, like in either direction. But I was like, oh man, if we drop another 10K, like this is going to look really bad. The buyer is either going to want to walk away or renegotiate for a much lower price. And then, I mean, I think pretty similarly, like just through luck, the next month, it was our best month ever in terms of revenue. And there wasn't even anything like I had done to drive it. It was just like, I think just momentum from past work. And so, yeah, by the end of it, like he was actually getting a better deal. But by the time we closed, it was 2.4 SDE. So yeah, fortunate. Like, and there was nothing that came out of due diligence that was really a surprise. So like if anything, like it would have been me asking for a different price, but I was very motivated to just like wrap it up and not rock the boat.
Yeah. And close it did. Well, it's great to have the deal behind you, and congrats on your child on the way.
Oh,
are you up for a quick lightning round before I let you go?
Sure.
Okay. Let me ask a couple of questions. These don't take, you can just answer them in whatever length you want, but my questions will be short and you can answer them as quickly or not as you choose. You spoke to quite a few people about this business. What was the slimiest trick that somebody tried to play on you to kind of prey on your naivete?
I don't think anybody did anything like particularly slimy, but I had a funny conversation with somebody, I think probably around the time talked to FE, this guy reached out to me and he said like, oh, I'm a broker. Like I'd be interested in acquiring TinyPilot. And I was like, okay, great. Like I'll hear your pitch. And so he told me like he was really interested in the business, saw a lot of potential. And I was like, okay, great. And he's like, but would you be interested in like you continue running it and I am the owner? And I was like, no, that's the opposite of what I want. Like, I don't want to do all the work and have no upside. And he's like, okay, well, you know, like I'm happy to help you out. Like, what are the things that you need help with? And I was like, well, like, you know, marketing, I think is one of my weak points. And he's like, okay, I got a great suggestion for you. Buy a marketing company and just have them do marketing for you for free. And I was like, well, I don't really have money to buy a marketing company. He's like, no, you can buy a marketing company for like $1 million. And I was like, right, but I don't have $1 million lying around. He's like, no, you just finance it and you put no money down and you just have them do the work for you for free. And so I said, yeah, but then aren't I running a marketing agency? Like, I don't know anything about doing that. And he's like, no, they run themselves. And so like I ended this call and I was like, what was that? Like, is this a scam somehow? Or like, does this guy not know what he's talking about? Or do I not know what I'm talking about? Like, I was just kind of like, are people that really doing this? And like, is this effective for somebody? Or is this guy just like pretending to be some kind of entrepreneur? And I never figured it out.
Sounds pretty shady to me. What was the biggest mistake that you made during the selling process that you'd love to have a mulligan on, something you could do over if you had
that's a good question. I think the thing that felt the most difficult was drafting the asset purchase agreement and negotiating with the buyer over it. I think one thing I wish I had done earlier on is start preparing with my lawyer before we actually received the purchase agreement, because I don't remember when I looped him in. I knew which firm I was going to work with because I'd worked with them before on like other IP stuff for the company. But I didn't actually loop them in until either when I got the purchase agreement or slightly before. And I think there's a lot of pre-work you can do in approaching the deal that would have been useful to do ahead of time. And one thing I've considered, I don't know if this would actually work, but like, I kind of wish that Scott and I had sat down, like had a meeting with us and our lawyers and just kind of set the tone for how we wanted the negotiations to go. Because I got the sense that the buyer's attorney was like a little bit more, like was treating the deal as like a little bit more of like an aggressive deal than Scott or I even wanted it to be. Like, I think Scott and I were both like, you know, we both feel good about each other. We're both going to work together after the deal closes to make sure it's a successful transition. And I felt like the lawyer on the buy side was like treating it a little bit more as like, we're both trying to like, I don't know, squeeze the other one to get the best possible deal. And like, I don't think that's how we felt, but I felt like that ended up turning up the temperature on the negotiations. And I wonder if we had met face to face early on and just been like, hey, like this is like a friendly deal. We're cool with each other. We don't want to like kind of look for every opportunity, look for every edge. I wonder if that would have made it a little bit less stressful, but I don't know. It's so hard with these things because you get so few opportunities to try them. With like it's like not, you don't, unless you work in this business, you don't do an acquisition like that many times in your life. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, it's so Finn. Over the weekend, I was talking to a buddy of mine who's unfortunately going through a divorce, and his former spouse has got a lawyer who is one of these attack dog kind of lawyers who is trying to make everything super confrontational. And he was telling me about something called a collaborative lawyer, where the idea is like they kind of say, hey, look, let's collaborate on a solution here, and if both parties get a kind of more of an amicable lawyer. Again, I don't know much about divorce, thank goodness, but anyways, it reminds me of that notion of like finding a lawyer who's like collaborative as opposed to confrontational.
Yeah, that would have been great.
Yeah, interesting. Emotional high and emotional low in the process of selling your company.
I think emotional low was, let's see. I had a tendency to catastrophize like every setback in the negotiation. So there was one point where we were going through the contracts and realized like a lot of the contracts I had in place, they didn't have language around transferability. And so according to our lawyers, they like, you could just transfer them as an asset to the new owner. And like the new owner like now owns the contract with whatever vendor. But a few contracts did say like non-transferability. And we had one contract for a patent license for technology we used that specifically said that it was non-transferable. And it was like a pretty big, it was like a big company, and it took me a long time to actually get the license. And so when I realized that, I was like, oh no, like what if they just don't agree to transfer the license? Like what if the new buyer can't get it? And then like they just can't run the company because this technology is critical to us and like they don't have a license to it. And I like really catastrophized it and was like really panicking of like, oh no, like how did I not anticipate this? Like the deal is just going to fall apart because like they're not going to be able to get this license. And I think I really like got in my head and thought about like convinced myself it wasn't going to work out without any real evidence. And then like the next day, but the buyer was like, yeah, it's fine. I'll just talk to them. And like it ended up working out fine. It was super smooth. And like there was like really no reason to worry as much as I did. And I think emotional high, I don't know. It was like a very gradual process. Like even after the deal closed, like it didn't feel closed to me. Like I had spent so many months worrying about like anything that could have blown the deal that like even when the money landed in my bank account, it still felt like maybe it's not really going to happen. But I think, yeah, if I had to put a moment on it, it was like the night that we closed, my wife and I went out to dinner to celebrate. Like I hadn't gotten the wire transfer hadn't landed yet, but like the escrow company had told me that they sent it. And so I was like a little bit worried that like something was going to go wrong with the wire. And so I checked my email right before we got dessert, and I saw the email that was like, you've just received like $610,000. I was like, oh, great. And then like they brought over chocolate torte and like Oreo cheesecake. I was like, wonderful. This is a great time.
What a fun evening to celebrate for sure. Yeah. You've already been super generous in acknowledging my book, so I want to thank you for that. But were there other resources, tools, people that you could point our listeners to that would be helpful in educating themselves about the sale of a company?
Yeah, I mean, not to suck up too much, but I did get a lot of value out of listening to your podcast and hearing stories from other founders. And outside of that, I think the most valuable thing, the most valuable lessons I got was just from talking to people who had been through acquisitions. So like going to conferences where I would meet other founders and just asking them about like what their experiences were like. And then when I would talk to other people that are other founders, I would mention to them that I was thinking about selling, and either if they had experience or they knew somebody who had experience. Because it's such a thing, like it's a thing that so few people go through. Like when they find out you're doing it, people are interested in talking to you about it and giving advice. So I got a lot of value out of those conversations. So like I would recommend if somebody was in my position, just if you know any founders that are like even like 1 or 2 degrees connected to somebody who is sold in a similar situation, just start like putting out feelers and seeing if somebody is willing to talk to you.
That's great. I'm a big believer in getting out there and getting to conferences and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Pressing the flesh with the people in your industry. It's amazing what can happen. We'll put the show notes in the show notes. We'll put links up to MicroConf, which is sort of a bootstrap SaaS conference, generally SaaS and technology. Yep. But it's a great conference for folks who are in that space for sure. Last question. What did you buy yourself as a trophy to commemorate the win?
I'm not so into like trophies because eventually they just become like a thing that I have to drag around. The thing that I bought to like feel like it was making it final was the desserts. So like I had the dessert that night with my wife, and then over the next 2 days I invited out friends to dinners and lunches, and like I'm a big dessert person, so I would pick places that had really good desserts. And so over the course of the next 3 days I had like 6 different desserts with people.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was great.
That's a great, fun way to win, or at least commemorate the win.
Yeah.
Not great for the waistline, but at
Yeah.
least you get to celebrate in a fun
Yeah.
fashion. Michael, I appreciate you sharing the story. I think it's amazing, and as somebody who does this frequently, it's so nice to see the details that you were able to provide, and
Sure.
also that Scott was gracious enough to let you talk about some of the details, because I think that's super helpful for people. We always hear about these giant, $1 billion acquisitions, but it's the real Mainstreet acquisitions are where a lot of the opacity, or there just isn't a lot of information for folks. And so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, sure.
The blog, which I'd encourage everybody to check out, where you detail a lot more about the sale, mtlynch.io. So M as in Michael, T as in Thomas, lynch.io is your blog. Is there anywhere else people can learn about you if they want to connect on social? Is there a good channel to do that on?
I'm on Twitter. I'm at Deliberate Coder, and I'm on Mastodon, M at mtlynch.io, or Michael at m.mtlynch.io. But yeah, the blog is probably the best place. And
Great.
If you want to follow along with what the new owner of TinyPilot is continuing to work on it. So tinypilotkvm.com is where you can see information about their updates. And they're continuing to make the product better. And I'm watching that too. I'm excited to see what they do without me.
Fantastic. We'll put all of those links in the show notes at builttosell.com. Michael, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much. This is a lot of fun. And I read your book probably 7 years ago. And so it's a real treat to get to talk to you.